who were in the lecture right before we closed down the school, we were talking about descriptive analysis. And descriptive analysis is one of the more advanced methods. It's the last method that we're going to be covering in this course. And we were talking about the methodology behind it. I'm going to work back through the slides and do a 3-lecture series here on descriptive analysis. But this was the slide that I was struggling to find in the slide deck. Again, these slides were courtesy of Amy Bowen, who was one of our early instructors for this course. Amy Bowen being one of the research scientists in charge of consumer studies at Vineland Research and Innovation Center. And this slide was particularly useful because we were talking about how when we're training our panelists to participate in a descriptive analysis, we have to go through training and we need to give appropriate benchmark samples. And in some cases, we can craft those samples ourselves within the parameters of the food product we're testing. And in other cases, you might find that there are relatively useful reference samples that you can buy off the grocery store shelf. It's really up to you as the analyst to determine what's the appropriate strategy. And again, we've talked about this over and over through the semester. If your aim is to be publishing in the scientific literature or doing research studies on behalf of major corporations, then you are going to be wanting to do one of these accredited or trademarked methods for doing your descriptive analysis. And if you're bootstrapping at a small company and you're using this to really help benchmark your product, but the scientific accuracy on this and the statistical relevance on the analysis doesn't need to be absolutely spot on, then you may be doing a lot more bootstrapping methodology. So we have to train our panelists, and this was the slide that I was looking for in our class right before the school got shut down. In this case, they're talking about the different textures in one of the trademarked methods for descriptive analysis, in this case, the spectrum method. And they have gone through within their methodology and said, here are some relative products that you can buy off the grocery store shelf that can help train your panelists to specific texture attributes or sensory attributes. And they've gone through within their trademark method and provided a whole different catalog of different scoring and training tools to help people within their training programs. So descriptive analysis, again, this is in many cases a trademarked system of doing sensory analysis, and there are a number of different organizations that provide a lot of structure and training for how to deliver on this. But again, we're taking a bootstrapping approach and we're using some of those methodologies. Again, I stress this as being incredibly important. If you are going to be doing descriptive analysis routinely as part of your work, it is worthwhile to go and get the functional training from one of these organizations. One of the methods that I have worked with in the past was a quantitative determination analysis, QDA. And again, it's a trademark program, and you should have the functional training from the organizations that have developed these. But for the purposes of this lecture, let's plow ahead, because again, it's very introductory, and in the end, my anticipation at when you have completed this lecture is that you'll have a knowledge level taxonomy. You have an introductory awareness of the tools that are out there, and you know how to go and ask more questions to be able to become competent in this field. So descriptive analysis is very common, and there are a few different guidelines here. So first off, you need to screen those panelists. We've talked a lot about screening to make sure that you don't have individuals who have outlier characteristics within their palate or their sensory profile. And You're going to be doing some acuity testing. Can they tell the difference between two products? Can they rank samples in order of intensity? Do they have the capability of describing attributes in an articulate and meaningful way? In particular, too, are they also able to remember sensory attributes from session to session and be able to consistently score day after day or week after week the same products in a reliable manner? It's we were talking about the skewness of data, and if your panelists, after training them, start to skew all over the place, you have to retrain them, and that starts to add up to the cost of doing this type of sensory analysis. Descriptive analysis and QDA type panels can be extremely expensive because of the time commitment required for all the training, as well as the fact that you need these panelists to be committed for several weeks, if not several months, and you need them to consistently show up. That is either lost productivity cost, where you're pulling employees from your own organization, or you are paying external panelists, and to keep them there and to keep them for the long haul, you have to compensate them a bit more generously than just the baseline that you would for in and out in half an hour sort of sensory. So, can they verbalize, and can they use can they use the scale tools properly? I'm going to show you in the second lecture some of the scale tools, but in general they're using a 15-point scale or a 15-centimeter line scale. And are they able to consistently visually estimate where they are within that scale accurately? Are they going to fit into the panel? We'll talk about the phases of the panel, but they've got to be able to negotiate and build up a lexicon with the rest of their panelists. And if they are really aggressive or if they're really timid, they may not fit in really well. Why are they there? Again, so many times people join sensory analysis panels, but they're there because of the money rather than because of their commitment to the field of sensory analysis and the field of advancing food studies. Do they have any allergies to the product? Do they have any dietary restrictions? These are the sort of generic questions that are critical to be asking. Can they commit to attending the sessions reliably? Again, we are grateful to Amy Bowen for sharing these slides with us as part of her commitment to teaching the program several years ago. She works with a population that has a lot of snowbirds who travel out of the country in the wintertime, and she'll recruit a panel in the fall saying, hey, can we have your participation throughout the winter? And people say, oh, of course. And then a couple weeks later, they're in Florida. You need to make sure that the population that you're recruiting from is going to consistently show up for the duration of your study and be dedicated. Now, moving forward here, in general, you've got 10 to 15 panelists. Typically, you're going to err towards 15. Why? Because again, this type of panel runs for weeks and sometimes months on end. And on any given week or month, COVID notwithstanding, you may have one or two people who have various conflicts or commitments. They may be ill and therefore can't be there. By having 15, you're going to make sure that you have a robust enough data set. If you start with 10 and you're losing 2 or 3 every week, then you're not going to have robust enough data to have statistical relevance. Then we're going to do some training. We talked a little bit about the training, but we'll review that right now because of the lovely chaos that we've been experiencing with pandemic. But in that training, you will go through and spend about 10 to 25 hours. So if we just do that multiplier, you've put in at least 100 and upwards of closer to 300 hours of training, equivalent hours that you're compensating your people. And so you can see how this adds up really, really quickly. Let's say you're compensating at $20 an hour and you're doing an hour of training, 300, you spent $6,000 on training alone. That's not including your labor cost, and that's not including all your supply cost. So just the training component alone, you could be spending upwards of $10,000. And that's before you've got any data at all. So this is why this needs to be done extremely strategically. So in the training, there are a couple phases. You're going to develop a common lexicon. That's that vocabulary of words to describe the class of products that you're working with. You're then going to build up a consensus on what that line skill should look like, and you're going to monitor their performance to make sure that the panelists, after progressing in their training, are able to consistently score that product time and time again when they are seeing the same product time and time again. So, developing that common lexicon, you're going to be presenting those products with blinding codes, those 3-digit codes, so that they're not aware of what the product specifically is and any branding or any modifications that you've done. And they're going to go through and list all sorts of descriptors. So very similar to many of those tasting courses that you had, where you're just lining up all sorts of different words. And facilitator for this, in general, is a trained facilitator, and they're going to help determine what attributes are important, what the definitions of those attributes, what the evaluation method is, and really hone in on what the importance is. You remember back in the beginning of semester, we talked about the order of the sensory experience, and they'll help facilitate identifying what's the appropriate order of tasting or perceiving those different sensory attributes as well. You want to make sure that the attributes are sufficiently different among the products. So, for example, if you are doing, I don't know, a beverage product, you may not say, is it wet or not wet? All of them should be wet. And you want to make sure that there's a significant difference among the class of products that you're evaluating, such that it's worthwhile doing that attribute. Non-redundant, again, you want to make sure that it's useful and practical, and not just reinforcing the inevitable within this product range. If you're adding citric acid and you're watching something get more and more sour, is it even relevant and worth your time to be evaluating that? You want to make sure that the attributes are something that you can put onto a line scale. When we say unidimensional, that you can ramp it up or ramp it down in terms of its in terms of its prevalence within that product, and that those the panelists are able to evaluate that increase or decrease of the attribute. Last but not least, you want to make sure that you are able to find a reference for that attribute. And so if you're thinking of something that's incredibly obscure and you want to score it, are you going to be able to train people on it and find a relevant product or doctor up a product in a meaningful way so that people can properly score that attribute? If I was going to say geosamin, but I think a lot of people actually know what geosamin is. Thinking of some of these wonderful chemical compounds that technical analysts might know about, your people who you're recruiting from the general public might not understand what you're talking about. Then you need to go through and get consensus on that line scale. And so this is where having appropriate reference products is going to help. And they're going to be training on perhaps 2 or 3 different attributes per session. Now, again, this also depends on the background of the individuals that you're recruiting. So I have done descriptive analysis on beverage products for a wide variety of different clients. And sometimes we've been able to get trained brewmasters or trained sommeliers to participate in our sessions. And there we were able to do far more attributes at a time within the training, because these are individuals who have already refined their vocabulary, refined their lexicon, and have a shared perception of what these attributes are because of their fundamental backgrounds in beverage service or beverage manufacture. But if you're pulling from the general public, 2 to 3 attributes is about as much as someone from the general public can manage. Then you're going to run through those different samples and see if you can identify if they can they identify if it contains the attribute or not, and where does it fit within the within the ranking or the scale that you're working from. You can see if your panelists are capable of ranking products in the correct order consistently, and that helps the panelists understand the concentration or the amplitude of the different attributes within that product. So if they can get that ranking test in the right order, then you know that they'll be capable of doing the line scale appropriately. You do want to make sure that people are capable of referencing within the line scale as well, because as we're moving forward within descriptive analysis, most of the time analysts are going to be using what's called a 15 centimeter line scale. This 15 centimeter line scale relates back to the fact that 15 centimeters fit really nice on a 8.5 by 11 photocopy paper. And so back in the day when analysts were doing all of their panel design on paper handouts, the 15 centimeter line scale was incredibly practical and gave a lot of rich data. It wasn't too short, like a 10 centimeter line scale. You'd think 10 would be more practical to work from, but this gave a bit more dimension while still fitting conveniently on the paper with having enough margins to put notes. Now everyone's gone online and we're still thinking in 15 centimeter line scales, however, and so we usually will convert the 15 centimeter line scale into a 150 point line slider. So as you're building that consensus within the line scale, you do need to go through and rate the different products. And there's a lot of group discussion. And so that group discussion, this is why it's really critical to make sure you've got a group that has a nice even keel in terms of attitude and ability to vocalize their opinions. If you have someone who's really bossy or someone who's really timid, they may not be effectively participating in the group discussion, or maybe easily swayed by someone else who's within that group discussion as well. Then you're going to build up consensus and you make sure that you've got good panel performance. We were talking a different day about using ANOVA for checking the skewness of our data, and we can evaluate the standard deviation. It's really up to the analyst and up to the different trademark methods what is an appropriate standard deviation, but what you want to do is minimize that standard deviation as much as possible within the same sample. So we've built up a bit of consensus on these different products. Again, those of you who are registered in the course have these notes within your Blackboard, but you want to be able to identify that you've got consensus on that attribute and the reference standard. The reference standard has to be consistent. You could be building up reference standards if you're working within a certain product class. So for example, if you are trying to do bitterness, you might be adding quinine into your product. Quinine has an incredibly bitter flavor. Or if you want something that has a acid profile, you may be putting in a small quantity of citric acid into that product. Those spike samples are good for concept formation, but again, they're not always feasible. Something that we've also done was negative samples. So for example, one time we did a panel where we were doing applesauce, and we were able to create a negative attribute sample where we took the applesauce and we put it onto a coffee filter and we gently rinsed the applesauce out with deionized water. And you can imagine all of the apple flavor, all of the sweetness, all of the acidity more or less dissipated from that applesauce. And then we were able to build up a pretend applesauce that had very specific amounts of apple flavoring, very specific amounts of sweetness, very specific amounts of acidity, and so on. There are certain ways of stripping out a sample. So beverages, sometimes you can treat with deactivated carbon, which will strip off flavor profiles, and you can build them back up artificially for the purposes of spiking and creating references. But those are useful in the training phase, but they are not always reliable predictors when dealing with them all the time. Make sure that you're able to repeat that if you're doing that sort of spiking. Then you're still working on building up consensus. And again, you can see why QDA is difficult, because you have to do all of this upfront work before you've even collected a single bit of data. It's absolutely critical that you have this robust background with your panel before you start collecting data. So you're going to present the panelists with different options for the reference samples so they can get their concept. You're going to make sure that you've got agreements on what those reference samples are. You want to make sure that they agree on the intensity, and make sure that you've got to make sure the intensity is relative too. If you over exaggerate or under exaggerate the intensity with respect to the samples that you actually need to be evaluating, you could be pushing all of your data into one end or the other end of the scale and not be able to see clear differences between your products. Make sure that spiked samples are going to be realistic relative to the type of product. I think of one panel that I did where we needed to do metallic flavor in, metallic off flavor in beer. And we put in, I think it was like 10 parts per million ferrous sulfate into a classic North American lager. And the panelists were absolutely livid. They were like, this is like licking pipes. Oh my God. We thought 10 parts per million was going to be completely realistic. And meanwhile, our reference standard was completely off. So we still haven't even collected data yet. We are screening, we're selecting the panel, we're training the panel. Now we're checking to make sure that they have good repeatability and panel agreement. So the repeatability, let's say you were to present the sample one week and then present the same sample the next week. You want to make sure that panelist A is scoring extremely similar from week 1 to week 2. And the panel agreement means that panelist A, panelist B, panelist C are all within a certain standard deviation on their response. So you need to have repeatability and agreement on this. And so again, this is likely another couple weeks worth of evaluation before you've even started to collect data. So we're monitoring their performance. We're going to put 4 to 6 samples in on the training day and make sure that they're seeing those attributes in the same way, in the same frame of reference, and that they're repeatable. You're measuring their performance typically using ANOVA. And again, this is not a stats class, and I understand that in most of the participants who are taking this class with me have not taken a formal stats class. But you're going to check ANOVA and standard deviation to make sure that the skewness on that data is within the tolerance that you define for the standard deviation. So we did ANOVA in a different week, and I can do some more content on ANOVA if there's requests for this. So panel evaluations are making sure that repeatable across sessions and that they're within that appropriate discrimination. So you can also do standard deviations on the panelist performance to make sure that they've got appropriate amount of skewness across that group. I'm going to just jump through this a little bit quicker here. These would be examples. So let's just do a quick little talk about this panel. What do we see here with these panel? What do I see here? I see a general consensus between assessor 5, assessor 3, assessor 2. Do you see that same patterning? We note that assessor 1 is following that same patterning, but they need to be retrained to set their, they need to be retrained to move the attribute up higher within the scale. Do you see how they're following that the same pattern? Assessor 4, that would be this line here. Let's follow that line. Assessor 4 perhaps they missed that training because they seem to be doing things in an opposite pattern. So first question I would have, given that I'm seeing an exact opposite patterning, are they using the scale correctly? Are they switching the attribute directionality? That's the first question I have, because the pattern's following almost in a backwards pattern. They may also be an anomaly relative to the attribute. Perhaps on the day of this assessment, they had a head cold and couldn't smell properly or couldn't taste properly. Perhaps this is an attribute that they have an emotional aversion to, and therefore they have a bias towards the attribute and score it inappropriately. If assessor 4 can't be remedied in quick succession, I would be thanking them very much for their service to the panel and excusing them and not having them return. Whereas assessor 1, I think we can retrain them to say, you know what, here's the sample, this should be scoring approximately 5. Here's a sample, it should be scoring approximately 6 or 7, and retrain them to help them calibrate back to the rest of the group. I'm going to skip this because we are not going to talk about all of the advanced stats methods, but as we're getting closer to actually starting to collect data, then you want to run through a dress rehearsal, and that's where you're going to test all the products under the real testing conditions and run the panelists through those testing conditions to make sure that they understand the whole grasp of everything. At this point too, you're getting rid of any reference samples. We need to get to the point where those panelists do not need references. That said, in many instances, I have seen lots of organizations put reference samples back in to make sure that there is appropriate calibration, but they're not labeled as reference samples. They are blinded into the cohort of samples that the analysts are actually going to be collecting. So I have also participated in panels where they have said, wait a second, you're now that we're collecting data, we're realizing you're all over the place, and they had to go back and retrain us. It was a good time. So you do need to make sure that there's panel agreement. You need to make sure that their panelists are able to discriminate appropriately and that the results are reproducible week on week and within the panelists themselves. And finally, we can do some product profiling. Woo, finally. I'm going to stop with the notes here because I'm actually going to jump into some real case studies, and I'm going to have two additional lectures. One is on the data collection part, and one is on the data analysis part. And so at this point, I'm going to stop this lecture, and I will label this as lecture number 1. So again, the theory component behind descriptive analysis, and we'll jump into part 2 momentarily. Thank you very much.